Hello, my name is Nastasia Getchim, and I'm leading on the Equalities Resource Hub, a programme that brings together evidence and tools to support policymakers, researchers, and practitioners to advance gender inequalities around the world. Today, I'm joined by Diane Kingston OBE. Diane is a human rights defender and international development specialist. She's currently the Global Technical Lead for Disability Rights and Equalities at Sightsavers. Diane is also involved in the Promoting Equalities regional programme, which the Equalities Resource Hub is a part of, and really helps us to ensure that disability inclusion remains at the heart of all the work that we do. Hi, Diane. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thanks. So in terms of kicking us off, I thought it'd be really great just to understand a little bit more about your background. So you've had such an incredible career as a human rights defender and a disability advocate. Could you share a little bit about your background and your personal journey and what led you to become such a prominent advocate for disability rights?
Sure. I think for me, I grew up in a household that was very political, and we talked about politics a lot. This is a conversation I've had with various people who have become sort of, key advocates in their field. I'm like, so kind of what started you on that journey? What was the beginnings? And often it's about their home environment and how politicized that was. And I think from, quite an early age, I had very strong core values, especially around fairness and justice and equality. And so my advocacy journey really started first as an environmental activist, then as a women's rights activist, and then I later became involved in disability rights. And the main trigger for becoming an activist in disability rights was that all my life I've struggled with my mental health, and mental health seems to be a kind of buzzword, and everybody talks about mental health and well-being now. But for many decades, it was really taboo and very stigmatized here as in the UK, as well as the rest of the world, where it continues to be a lot of the time. And I was working out in Indonesia with VSO. I was a co-director of the program there and managed quite a large EU grant that was around promoting the rights of people with disabilities and building a national disability network. And it was during my time in Indonesia that I had a road traffic accident, and which ended up with me becoming an amputee. I lost my leg. And I remember having a conversation with some organizations of people with disabilities after I'd lost my leg, and they were like, oh, now you're one of us. Now you've kind of joined the club. And I said, well, actually, I kind of struggled with my mental health all my life, and I take quite a lot of different medication to help with my mental health. So if you like, I've been a person with a disability kind of all this time. And they were like, yeah, but that's not like a real disability. And I was like, oh, that was a big light bulb moment for me. And I returned to the UK for rehabilitation and realised that I couldn't go back and work overseas as an amputee because of lots of different complications. But I realised that having a physical impairment was actually opening a door for me to have a conversation with disability activists in the UK and in different countries and bringing mental health to the table. So that was a really exciting period. I was like, oh, I can actually make a difference now because my voice is kind of validated by other people with disabilities, the most visible disabilities, whether people with wheelchair use or whatever. And I applied to become a government advisor on disability as part of an open call. I think that was back in 2008, 2009, something like that. And I met lots of other disability activists. And as I said, I brought mental health to the table, and still it was quite a push within that group to get mental health recognised on an equal basis as other impairment groups. So that's a little bit of my background.
Well, what an incredible story. Actually, yeah, I didn't know any of that. And yeah, just really highlighting, I think, the difference between, these visible disabilities and these visible impairments versus the ones that are invisible. And there's still been quite a lot of work to raise the profile of those that are invisible. And I guess, yeah, with people knowing that you've got the kind of lived experience, suddenly, your sort of fight for disability inclusion sort of became a bit more real, a bit more serious almost.
And I think, I'm not defined by my disability, by my impairment. I don't go around sort of saying, hey, I'm your disabled person here, come speak with me. I think all people with disabilities, they all have multiple identities, and some people want to have that as their primary identity, and that's what defines them and drives them. And I have a lot of respect for those people. But for others, it's just like, well, actually, hey, I'm Diane, and yeah, I happen to have a disability, and I champion disability rights, but I also champion the rights of women and girls. I champion, mental health advocates. I champion environmentalism and climate justice. So I think I'm a bit of a kind of campaigner through and through. But what really sort of floats my boat is working at the programme level, working with people who are very marginalised. And when you're working with a group of people who are starting almost sort of from zero, and you see them grow and develop and become excited about the cause, the disability movement, what they're going to do, it makes it so much more real. And it's just wonderful to lift other people up and watch them grow and fulfill their potential.
And so if you do look back at your journey now, is there a specific moment that you can think of in terms of your advocacy that really stands out for you as sort of a moment that you're most proud of, or that, felt especially rewarding?
Yeah, there is. I was very fortunate to be elected as the UK member of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I served my term on that committee. And again, I was the one who was quite pushy around the issues that were on the margins, on the edge. And I was working with people from, all over the world, 18 of us, all people with disabilities, from, all parts of the sort of globe. And I kept bringing the issues of LGBTQI people to the table and saying that these people with disabilities are some of the most marginalised and voiceless. And of course, that group of people are often criminalised for their sexual orientation, their gender expression or gender identity. And so there were members of the committee who are from those countries where it is criminalised. Uganda being a great example of where they've actually introduced the death penalty recently for people who identify as LGBTQI. And I had a real battle, I realised, on my hands with the other committee members who, especially from those countries where it was criminalised, that we actually name those people, because if we don't name that group of individuals, along with asylum seekers, internally displaced people, people living in institutions, and it isn't a shopping list, but there's a long list of very marginalised people with disabilities, and that particular group of people with disabilities are way marginalised. And so there was a huge amount of resistance from other committee members, and I took it on as kind of a bit of my mission to win them around. And I'm really delighted to say that people with disabilities who identify as LGBTQI, they're now named in various jurisprudence of the CRPD committee. So that means that states parties or kind of the government of the day has to take account of those people and ensure that their rights are upheld and protected and promoted. Yeah, so that was the proud moment for me.
Yeah, amazing. And I think it's also realizing about like the intersection of all of these different sort of, I guess, identities that come together to make you more or less sort of vulnerable or marginalized or at risk. And yeah, you sort of identifying this really, really critical area and making it your mission to bring it to the forefront, because either it's people aren't aware of it, or it doesn't sort of, they don't think about it, or
Yeah.
they're afraid to even approach it. And so just bringing it to the table and in such like a real way must have been, yeah, super rewarding.
Yeah, and I think there was another highlight on the committee too that I'd like to mention, which is I was one of the vice chairs of the committee, and I was chairing one of the sessions where we have the constructive dialogue with the country, and it was Uganda. And within the law in Uganda, people with mental health conditions are not allowed to stand for government or be in positions of high profile political life or other such roles. And so I was able to have this constructive dialogue with the government of Uganda and say to them, actually, this particular law that you have in place, I wouldn't be able to sit here and be doing this job, asking you these questions, if I was a Ugandan. And I think that was quite an eye-opener for the delegation that were there to realise that, well, actually, somebody with long-term mental health conditions can be capable and able to do and fulfill a role that is very demanding. And I hope that made some of them go away and think, yeah, maybe that's possible going
Mm.
forward at some stage.
Yeah, and I think it also makes you realize that sometimes the stigma is so great, and it kind of brings me to my next question. Um, what lessons have you learned from trying to influence policy, especially around sort of disability rights and inclusion at national or international level? Are there any sort of key lessons that you can share?
Yeah, I think at one point in the UK we had different bodies that were responsible for different what we call protected characteristics. So we had the Equal Opportunities Commission dealing with sexism. We had the Racial Equality Commission. We had the Disability Rights Commission. And not long after, only a few years after the Disability Rights Commission was established, the government decided to bring all of the different bodies together into one super body called the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which many of your listeners will have heard of. And so there was a statutory obligation within law to have a standing committee on disability within the new super body, so that disability rights were really mainstreamed within the government policies and so on. So it was a real pleasure working on that group, but I realised what resistance there was, because it was as if all these different protected characteristics were almost kind of competing for each other, and we kept having to kind of bring disability back into the picture. And yeah, that was quite a challenge, and I kept coming back to the realisation that lots of people were saying, oh, X government or X body or organisation doesn't have the political will. And I realised that this phrase, political will, was quite empty. That what we actually were saying were that there were key decision makers, specific named individuals who were resisting a change. And so rather than saying, oh, the UK government lacks political will on X, it was actually there are specific people within government who are making those decisions and being informed by their advisors around them. And it's those individuals that we need to target, take to one side, have the conversation with, explain. And I think this kind of brings me back to the Promoting Equalities regional programme, where you're gathering lots of evidence. There is absolutely zero point in sitting down with a key decision maker and arguing for a particular thing unless you've got good, solid evidence. And one of the best cases of evidence that I, as an individual, and others can bring to influence decision makers is around cost benefit analysis. So it's like, if we put $1 extra into education to ensure it's inclusive for children with disabilities, you will get $3 extra out in terms of economic production down the line when that person has got an education and is able to contribute to the economy. So yeah, I think that was an important lesson. And whenever I hear the term, oh, it's because there isn't political will, I'm thinking, who are you talking about?
And so from your experience, the resistance that you can sometimes experience is not necessarily sort of like because they don't care. Is it a lack of understanding, you would say?
Not necessarily. They may understand, but they may not have the evidence.
Right.
Or they may understand and have the evidence, but are surrounded by other people who are saying it's not a priority. And I remember when the Australian government brought out their first international development disability strategy, and they kind of did an international roadshow and they visited lots of different countries to promote this strategy. And I was like, this is really interesting that you've got disability front and center of your international development strategy. How did this happen? And they said, well, it's interesting that you say that because our Minister for International Development's brother is a person with a disability. And I'm like, there you go, bingo. You've got that personal connection, that you've got that lived experience of being with somebody with a disability, understanding the barriers and the challenges that they face, knowing that solutions need to be put in place for that person to thrive, survive, and really fulfill their potential. And you've gone and persuaded your colleagues in government, and you've gone one step further and you've actually produced a really brilliant inclusive development policy and strategy. So yeah.
Amazing. And so maybe moving on to today, and the reason why I wanted to really speak to you is around International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So this annual event that takes place on the 3rd of December. What does the day mean to you personally?
Well, it's a very important day in many respects. However, isn't every day International Day of People with Disabilities? Aren't we promoting disability rights every single day rather than going, oh, 3rd of December, that's disability? And often it's like a point in an advocacy calendar where there is so many other international days. The UN calendar of International Day of is so crowded. It's such a difficult space to get into. And each year there's a theme, and each year somebody wants to take a new angle. But I'm like, well, what about the other days of the year? What are happening on those days of the year? And it's a great day to celebrate the lives of people with disabilities and their achievements. But that comes from being in a real position of privilege for me, being proud to be disabled. Most people that I'm working with in developing countries, they can't be proud to be people with disabilities because they have no rights at all. They're hidden away in institutions or locked away in houses. Or they're subjected to such violence, exploitation, and abuse that you don't even want to think about that. So while it's a good day to bring all of these issues to the fore, to celebrate difference and diversity, let's not forget about all the other days. And if you're thinking about those other days, it's like International Women's Day. Okay, so what about women with disabilities? What are we saying about them there? And I try and introduce disability into lots of other different international days. So when we have 16 days of activism against violence against women, I've been focusing very much on gender-based violence in the work that I do.
Yeah. And how is there any advice that you would give on sort of keeping disability then on the agenda and making sure that it isn't reduced to just a day or a month or a theme?
Sure, there's lots of things you can do if you work in an organisation, hire more people with disabilities. If you're in the UK and you're an employer, there's a disability confidence scheme that you can sign up to, and there are different levels where you can commit. I think within FCDO, they have a disability employee network. We certainly do at Sightsavers. And I think the rest of the days of the year, if you don't know somebody who's got a disability, maybe ask yourself why you don't know anyone. If you do know someone, just spend a bit more time with them and ask them questions. So I think many people come with their own assumptions about what people with disabilities can and can't do, especially people with mental health conditions, especially people with what I would say are sort of long-term, persistent, sticky and intractable mental health conditions. So things like bipolar and schizophrenia. So I'm like, the rest of the year, if you know someone who's disabled, chat to them, have a cup of tea, ask them some questions, like you've asked me questions. How did I get to where I am now? I'm not some superpower. I'm just a regular human being. And I'm a little bit different from other people. But if I want to understand other impairment groups, so people who are on the autistic spectrum or deaf people, blind people, etc., there is this assumption that just because you're a person with a disability, you know everything about all different impairments, which is totally ridiculous. I've got no idea what it's like to be deaf. But my grandmother happened to be deaf, and I got to know her and her way of being and how I could communicate with her. And so I felt confident when I was working for the first time with deaf people in a developing country. But that was only because I'd spent a lot of time with my grandma. And if you take the time to ask the questions, you'll get more comfortable and you'll get more confident, realizing that most people with disabilities, we know what the barriers are for most people with disabilities. They've all been identified, and the disability movement itself focuses quite a lot on there are barriers to this, the barriers to that. I would really like to see a sea change and see us focusing on the enablers. And instead of just the barriers, we've identified them. How do we overcome those barriers? What are the solutions? How can we really channel our energy into addressing those things? Because it's far too much emphasis put on, oh, a person with a disability isn't able to do this. Oh, yeah, we know that. They can't do that. And they can't do that because there are these different barriers. But what actually enables you to do something? What would enable a young person to become the next leader? Not necessarily a disabled leader, but a leader in their own right. What do they need? And at Sightsavers, I did quite a big piece of research interviewing women with disabilities who were really struggling with being included in meaningful decision making, leadership, bringing the issues that were pertinent to them, such as gender-based violence or sexual reproductive health, or the right to form a family and so on. And I asked them what the challenges were, but I also asked them, what has enabled you to get into a position of leadership? What has enabled you to be sitting at the table, actually having your voice heard, but not just heard, but the things that you're saying acted upon? And when I asked those questions, the enablers were really interesting. Enablers could be having a really supportive partner or husband who was saying, yeah, I believe in you, go for it. Having access to resources, whether they were human resources or financial resources. Having somebody who's already trodden that path and being able to have a role model and been mentored or had been seconded into an organization where they were able to grow and develop. So all of those enablers are really important to me. And I'm like, yeah, let's do that. Let's really bump up the finances and the resources and get those women in those positions, saying what they want to say, being supported, not worrying about it not being a safe space, and not being ridiculed when they go home and say, hey, I did this at work today. I brought this to the table, but they're taken seriously by not just the immediate family members, but the wider family and the wider community. And they can be a role model themselves.
Yeah, amazing. And actually, just what you started saying at the start of your response really resonated, because I remember the first time I started sort of being introduced to disability rights, disability inclusion work, there was this model, and I forget the name now, about the onus, instead of the onus being on the disabled person and all of the barriers, the onus really being on society in the way that we've sort of designed, so for example, around accessibility, it's like we haven't designed things appropriately, and the onus is on people and infrastructure, and rather than the person with disabilities who's unable to use what has been designed in like a city, for example. And it is so much that once you have that experience, you understand. And it wasn't until I had a child and I had to use a pushchair that I realized that so few of the stations in London where I'm based are accessible. So few have lists, so few. And it's not until you are having to deal with that it becomes an issue and you realize just what a problem it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's I guess, yeah, just the light bulb moments you have throughout your life when you understand sort of what it can look like and what it means. Um, and I really loved what you said about leadership. And actually, I know that we've already touched a little bit on the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, but the key theme this year is really around leadership and how to promote person with disabilities really taking on those positions and exploring what the barriers or, more importantly, what the enablers are. So it's really interesting to hear that you've done this research, and some of them are just very practical, very real solutions that can really empower people to feel like they can take on those positions.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on a really good point there in terms of accessibility. One of the enablers or one of the solutions is putting in an elevator or having a ramp for anybody on wheels, whether you're a wheelchair user, whether you're pushing a pram, whatever wheels you've got. Wheels don't work with steps, we know that. So when you put in place an enabler, it doesn't just benefit people with disabilities, it benefits loads of other different people. When we talk about an accessible toilet, and I always remember Judy Heumann, who was a really fantastic international disability activist based in the United States. She made a superb film that's available on YouTube, actually, called Crip Camp, and it was about a whole group of young disabled people who went and did summer camp, and actually they became a very politicized group of people. And Judy in particular went on to bring about a lot of change. And she was saying, why do we have to be so grateful for an accessible toilet? And yet I still hear that conversation going on. It's like, we've put in place an accessible toilet. And I'm like, yeah, and it's not then a toilet that's accessible for people with disabilities. It's a toilet that's accessible for you with your child in a pushchair, or somebody who needs a level space, a level ground for mobilizing in any way. And so lots of the fixes, lots of the solutions would benefit greater society. Yeah.
Yeah. And we talk about developing accessible resources for people with disabilities, like easy reads or simple summaries or infographics. So different kind of more simple formats. And then you realize that everyone appreciates more simple formats. Not everyone loves to read a 20-page font size 11 document. And so although, it's kind of the push has maybe come from trying to be a bit more accessible and disability inclusive, really it benefits such a wide range of people.
Absolutely, great point. And, I was working with the World Health Organization when I worked with Sightsavers years ago, back in 2007. And I was part of a team that put together what was called the community-based rehabilitation guidelines. And they covered different thematic areas such as health, education, etc. And when we published those guidelines, we published them in English, published them in French, in Spanish, published them in Easy Read. And the most downloaded of all the formats was Easy to Read. And I love an easy to read, it's really clear. I get it straight away. It's short, it's got images stick in my mind. That's the type of learner I am. And yeah, I think, why not publish your annual report in easy read? No other formats, just easy read.
Yeah, exactly. And so we're kind of steering towards talking about the hub, the Equalities Resource Hub. And I know that you mentioned particularly in your work around influencing how important evidence is. But it would be good to hear, what the role you think of the hub is playing. So obviously the hub is really designed to promote inclusion by sharing practical and evidence-based tools and resources. And part of our mandate is to make, some longer form documents much more accessible, much more easy to read, much more practical. What do you think the hub plays in achieving this vision for kind of more inclusive and sustainable future?
Yeah, I mean, who goes to a library now? We all just go. Google has become a verb, hasn't it? Oh, let's Google it up. What can we find? Quick, I need some evidence on X. And so something like the Resource Hub is great because it's a one-stop shop for getting really good evidence. That's quality assured evidence. It's not anecdotal. It's something that offers a range of different practical tools and approaches. And what I love about the hub is it takes this intersectional approach. So it's not just looking at people with disabilities, full stop. It's looking at the intersection of LGBTQI issues, those, around Indigenous people with disabilities. It's looking at some really, really marginalised groups. And I think we can't have enough evidence. Something that we do at Sightsavers is that within our social inclusion team, we produce a set of what we call learning questions. And they're basically the questions that haven't really been answered about disability inclusion. And one of my learning questions, which led to the research I just talked to you about, was what are the enablers for women with disabilities to have more leadership positions, be more active in decision making, have the issues that matter to them addressed. And so that led to that piece of internal research, and that has given a number of recommendations internally to Sightsavers. And so we want to answer various different questions. And I think the Resource Hub sits there as a springboard to answer some of those questions that have been on people's minds for quite some time, and we don't have the answers to them yet. And for me, you can't chuck enough money at disability research. There are we've got our own research department within Sightsavers we're one of the few international NGOs who are registered as a bona fide research institute ourselves, and we rely really heavily on the research that we're able to do. There are other organisations that conduct their own research. There's different universities that have different departments doing their research, but there's just still isn't enough evidence. And so I see this as a really positive way forward. And I really like the way that it connects with how the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office are operating on the ground, what their people want to know more about, what questions are important to them, and what answers and evidence we get as a result of that. So, yeah, I would encourage everybody to go online, Google up what they're promoting Equalities Regional Programme is at FCDO, take a look at the content there.
And while you were talking, I was thinking about, these sort of learning questions and what they're all leading us towards. And I was wondering whether you have a sense of, looking forward, very far forward. What would you say true inclusion will look like?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it, really? I don't think that I will see true disability inclusion in my lifetime. And I'm not being pessimistic. I'm only basing that on the women's movement. So we looked at, we had a first wave of feminism, women getting the right to vote, second wave of feminism. We had, women gathering together and really, putting forward their concerns around gender, what we now call gender equality. So there was this shift from focusing just on women to focusing on the power dynamics between men and women and looking at gender. And I think, how many decades has that taken us to get to the point at which we're at now? And do we have true equality? And are the rights of women and girls worldwide upheld, promoted, and their rights protected? No. We're still having cases that come through our legal system in the UK where women are not getting equal pay for doing the same jobs, especially in areas such as academia. Women are not earning the same rates as their male counterparts. So if it's taken, the Beijing Declaration, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, we've got various treaties that look at gender-based violence and a whole raft of legislation and policies, and we still don't have gender equity. So true disability inclusion is when we don't actually have to talk about disability inclusion, for me. It just happens. But boy, have we got a long way to go. So, yeah.
And it's so true, especially in this context and this worrying trend on the rollback of rights. So even for the rights that we almost took for granted that we had won, now they're under question again.
Absolutely.
And so it's not like a simple upwards straight trajectory. It can also kind of go backwards before it can go further forward. So it's not that straightforward.
And I was reading an article recently about, you talk about rollback of rights, and there's Roe versus Wade, the abortion laws in America, and how they were really rolled back during Donald Trump's first term as a president. And what that looked like across different states in America. And I read recently that actually there's an increasing number of young women in the UK who are also pushing to roll back the right to free and accessible abortion services, and really leaning towards that alt-right movement, which for me shows that we haven't won yet. We need to keep pushing. And then there are more new and emerging issues around transgender rights, for example, which is a hugely contested space, where feminists are butting heads with other women's groups, where we have situations in our prisons where transgender women are being placed in male prisons. And, there's a whole raft of other new issues that are arising, coming to the forefront, that we need to deal with. So I think as a human rights defender, that there's always going to be work to be done. And I think we have to celebrate those little wins. I remember when I was sitting on the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we worked very closely with other international treaty bodies, and one of them was the Committee Against Torture. And that was chaired by a professor from Bristol University. He came and spoke to our committee, and he said, you're a new committee, you're ambitious, but you have to focus as well on the little wins. And he gave an example of visiting a prison, and within an area, say 6 meters by 6 meters, it wasn't supposed to hold more than 25 prisoners. And he went into a prison to do an inspection, because that's how the Committee Against Torture works. And there were 100 people in that space. And so he said, even by reducing it to half that number, to 50 in that space, it's a little win. You're not going to get exactly what you want straight away. You need to chip away a little bit. And that really shaped the way in which I looked at some of the most intractable human rights issues affecting people with disabilities, that we might not be able to have everything immediately, but we have to keep just chipping away. And each time we have a little victory, we absolutely need to celebrate that and shout about it.
Totally, I really like that message, and maybe talking about little wins or big wins. So I know that you were awarded an OBE in 2010 for your contributions to disability rights and equal opportunities. And I'd just love to hear sort of what that meant for you, and the ways in which it might have shaped your journey since.
My first reaction was, you got the wrong person. The postman has delivered this letter and somehow my name's on it and it's not meant to be on it. But when it sunk in, I realised that it actually wasn't about me. It was really about all the people who had been around me, helping build my capacity and my capability in the field of disability rights and equalities. And for me, it was a celebration of all of my allies that I'd been working with, and especially the people who had mentored me and lifted me up. And what it's meant for me going forward are two things. One is, in my everyday, I'm always thinking, how can I lift up another person with a disability? And in my case, especially a woman with a disability. I come into contact with so many different women with disabilities. To be able to share some of my knowledge or some of my experience that they will take away and run with it, and it will make a difference in their life, is one of the most fulfilling things, to lift other women up. And the second is, I don't usually put those 3 letters after my name very often, but sometimes it can be super useful. So if I want to get to an influencer or a decision maker, I will put those 3 letters after my name. And that makes a difference sometimes, because in other people's eyes who don't have, who haven't been part of the honours list, they think that it's something really outstanding, that you must be an incredible individual, that you must have done something super amazing. But for me, it reflects my constant love of giving back, of contributing to public life. And I'm not the only person in Sightsavers with letters after my name. Our chief executive, our deputy director, they have gongs as well. Our board of trustees, we've got Sir Chris Whitty on our board. We've got our chair, who's also got a knighthood. So I think it's a reflection of those who are committed to public service and public duty and go over and above their job to give back. And I think all of us in common are a little bit like a stick of rock, which is an English seaside sweet if people are listening from overseas. And you cut it in half and it's got letters in it, it's written all the way down it. And I think if you cut me in half, I say my duty to public service is there. And I think all those other individuals, it's the same. It's just in our DNA.
Yeah, amazing. And I just think it's brilliant that people like you and the others that you've highlighted at Sightsavers are recognized in, such a big way, and that it allows you to kind of open more doors to continue to do this really important work. Well, thanks so much. I've got one final question, which is just around sort of the final message that you want to share.
Sit down and have a cup of tea with someone with a disability and ask them what motivates them and what their hopes and aspirations are.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Diane. It was really so brilliant to speak with you today. So if you would like to find out more about the Equalities Resource Hub, you can find us on equalitieshub.org. And there you can also find links to our social media accounts, and you can sign up for our newsletter while you receive the latest news and resources straight to your inbox. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Okay, bye-bye.